Good morning or good afternoon. Hey guys, and welcome to our penultimate week of education. That means the next to last week before we start winding down and doing makeup days to finish out the year. I cannot believe we have gotten to the end of the year. It's crazy. The time has just flown by. And I know the work at home has been incredibly hard, and I wanted to thank each and every one of you for putting in the effort that you have, because you have made all the difference. So thank you so very much. Today we're going to dive into plants versus animals in gas exchange as we finish off our year looking at anatomical systems of plants and animals. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive right on in. Our goals for today is we want to be able to compare and contrast animal systems of gas exchange and figure out, first of all, what that means, identify the vessels that allow for gas exchange, and to be able to draw, or at the very least describe, the concept of counter-current exchange. So let's go ahead and begin. So we talked about the circulatory system last time, and we talked about how all of this stuff has to be transported through your body, and especially in animals, we talked about how so much oxygen has to be transported through the body to the muscles of the body. We talked about in plants how it had to be water and sugar, and in animals, that stuff too. So today, we're going to focus on something that isn't quite so solid. We're going to talk about how all animals, since photosynthesizers began producing oxygen, have really relied, and all organisms, not just animals, have really relied on gas exchange. In other words, the use of some sort of gas as a fuel source. So if you guys remember from the component of the lesson I taught on the prokaryotic kingdoms, we talked about how photosynthesizers had changed the world. We said that when photosynthesizers began producing oxygen and releasing it into the atmosphere, it was poisonous for many of the organisms of that time. So most of the organisms on Earth died because oxygen started to be produced. But oxygen was produced and it was used because it was such a good fuel source. It's such a highly reactive molecule that it wants to go in there and exchange electrons and make bonds and release energy and do all this stuff. It was perfect as a fuel source for all those metabolic reactions that organisms had to do. And so the entire world basically switched in a geological instant to using oxygen as a fuel source instead of using the other gases they had been using. And this completely revolutionized our entire planet's atmosphere. It actually made it so that it reduced the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and it made our whole planet freeze over. And so, you know, that was a huge thing. Because the heat was no longer being trapped by those greenhouse gases. So the world turned into a giant snowball for millions of years and all this stuff. But anyway, so the point is, though, that since this happened, since photosynthesizers completely changed the course of evolution on the planet and made oxygen the main fuel source for the production of chemical energy, such as ATP, we've now shifted over into this new era. And it's required for all organisms to have some system of respiration in order to usually take in oxygen and to expel whatever waste product or gas. Now, that's not to say that every organism on Earth uses oxygen. In fact, there are still many organisms for which oxygen is poisonous, and they are our anaerobic respirers. They don't use oxygen. But for the most part, most eukaryotic organisms use aerobic respiration. And so that's what we're going to talk about, because for aerobic respirators, we use oxygen, we take in oxygen, and that powers cellular respiration, and we release CO2 as a waste product. Okay, so the point of gas exchange, what we're going to talk about, is how does that process occur and what sort of things does it require. Now, the other thing I want to talk about today, especially when we're looking at plants versus animals, is how do plants breathe? Because when we think about gas exchange in animals, we think, oh yeah, lungs, right? We use lungs to breathe, right? Airways and lungs. But how do plants breathe if they don't have lungs? And why do we say that plants produce oxygen if they, just like animals, also use it for respiration? Did you know that? Plants breathe in oxygen and they release CO2. That's so wild. But we usually say they breathe in CO2 and release oxygen. So what's the deal? We're going to talk about that here as we dive in a little deeper. So what is the purpose of gas exchange? Okay, just to clarify, gas exchange is when one gas goes into an organism, usually to power some sort of cellular or molecular thing, and another gas, usually a waste product, comes out. So gases are a source of energy. Okay, we've talked about the energy required for reactions to occur. We said that was called activation energy. And the activation energy is, for example, the amount of energy it would take in order to attach that third phosphate group onto an ADP to make an ATP, which we know ATP is like the main fuel source for your body, okay? So you need some sort of energy to make any metabolic process in your body work, such as breaking down your food, producing ATP, the stuff you need to survive. Okay, so gases are sources of that energy because gases are made out of elements, and elements contain electrons, and electrons are what these elements use to bond to each other. We know that energy is released and stored when we form and break bonds. Okay, so basically a bunch of bonds are being broken and formed all over your body, and this is producing or storing energy, and that produced or stored energy leads to further reactions which allow you to do all the stuff you need to keep up your homeostasis and to survive. Okay, so it's weird to think about because normally when we think about fuel for our bodies, we think about food. But in actuality, the oxygen that you're breathing in every second is the only reason why you're able to even break down and process that food into a form you can use in your body. So really, food is fuel, yes, but so is the oxygen that you breathe. Okay, so most animals breathe in O2 and breathe out CO2. Most plants also use CO2, but they do also breathe in O2 and breathe out CO2. This is one of the most common gas exchange systems, and it's what we're really going to look at today. So what are the requirements of a good gas exchange system? A great gas exchange system has to involve usually at least two kinds of gases. Some sort of open and permeable membrane or surface or hole through which the gas can actually diffuse through into and out of the body, and some mechanism or force that actually pushes or pulls the gas into and out of the body. If you don't have these three things, and you might think these seem very familiar because they are very much like the respiratory requirements, if you don't have these three things, you won't be able to have an efficient gas exchange system. So let's talk about plants. Weirdly enough, the organ that plants use to breathe is not lungs, but leaves. Plants use their leaves to breathe. Now that must seem very, very strange, but in actuality, if we look at it, it actually makes a whole lot of sense. Okay, so let's look at this diagram of a leaf for a second. So what this picture is showing is a cross-section of a leaf. In other words, if I took a leaf and I took a knife and I split the leaf straight down the middle, and then I held up the leaf so I was looking right at the split through that knife edge, right, that very thin edge that I was looking at the leaf, this is what I would see if I could see cellular detail. Okay, so we see up here at the top of the leaf, we have a waxy cuticle, and that's, if you've ever felt a leaf, sometimes it feels waxy on the top, that's what this is. It's a layer of lipids that helps to prevent water loss from the leaf. Water, yes, let's keep going. Okay, so underneath that we have epidermis, and this is just like your skin. It's sort of a tough layer of tissue that allows for the plants to be able to not only block some of the UV damage from sunlight, but also to protect them, right? So in case, something scrapes up against the leaf, or maybe a branch scrapes the leaf or whatever, some damage to the leaf, it has some sort of surface to protect it, just like your skin. Underneath that are palisade mesophyll cells, and these are the primary photosynthetic cells. We can see they contain a bunch of chloroplasts, which are here shown as these green circles, some mitochondria, because those are also important for all those metabolic reactions, and large central vacuoles for storing all the products for photosynthesis, as well as the water required to allow photosynthesis to occur. Palisade mesophyll cells, you can see, are arranged vertically in the leaf, and that's because we can fit more of them in a vertical arrangement than we could in a horizontal. This increases the amount of surface area and thus the amount of photosynthesis that can actually occur. Down here we have the spongy mesophyll, which is just like the palisade mesophyll, but performs slightly less photosynthesis. So basically, the sunlight that isn't absorbed by the palisade cells is absorbed by the spongy cells and is used to power more photosynthesis for the plant. But around the spongy mesophyll cells, we see that there's actually a lot of open space. This is literally air. It's air. Did you know that leaves are full of air? And all of this air that's within the leaf is going to be the primary space that gas exchange is going to occur. Now, over here, before I go any further, we have our vascular bundles, okay? So we have that ground tissue as well as the phloem and the xylem, and the phloem is bringing in sugars or taking sugars away, usually taking them away from leaves because it's taking the sugar produced by the photosynthesis and putting it in some other place the plant needs. And then we have xylem that's bringing water to the leaf, into the leaf. And in fact, the xylem is bringing water into the leaf in the form of water vapor. Okay, so it is gasified water, okay? So water particles floating in a gas form through this. We also see down here at the bottom, we have another layer of epidermis, of course, to protect the plant, but then we have these openings right here in the bottom of the plant, and these openings are the openings that allow for gas exchange in plants, okay? So with us, when I breathe in, just like I just did, I breathe in through this tube, right? I open my mouth and I breathe in, or I breathe in through my nose or something, and the gas goes through my face, basically, and down through a tube in my throat. That's the opening for me. For plants, that opening is what we call stomata, okay? Or stoma for plural. And we can see these down there at the bottom. And they're surrounded by specialized cells called guard cells, which either allow the stoma to open or the stoma to close. When the stoma or stomata is open, it allows for CO2 to come in. Now we know CO2 is a gas that is essential for photosynthesis to occur. So when the guard cells open up, the CO2 is allowed in. And the oxygen produced by the plant, the excess oxygen that the plant doesn't need, is released from the plant. Now, I just said that the plant doesn't need it. The plant does need some oxygen, but it produces more than it needs. So that additional oxygen is off-gassed through the stoma as well. So we have the first piece of the plant's gas exchange. We have the organ that this takes place in with the opening that allows for the gas to come in or go out of the plant. Okay, great. So let's go a little bit further. Let's talk a little bit more about stomata. So I said they're openings in the undersides of plant leaves. If you looked at them through a microscope, the image on the right-hand most part of the slide will show you what they look like. These tiny openings. On either side of the openings are these guard cells that are shown in the two illustrations to the left of that microscopic image. When guard cells are inflated by water, they open and allow the stomata to commit gas exchange with the outside air. If the guard cells are dry, in other words, there's no more turgor pressure or water that's making them rigid and sort of curved, then they close. So when they're filled with water, they open, and when they're devoid of water, they close shut. And this helps to control when air or gas is going to be exchanged within the plant. Okay, so when they're inflated, CO2 comes in, oxygen goes out. When they're not inflated, nothing goes in or out. Okay, so the plant, the leaf is cut off from gas exchange. Now, why is this true? Why is it that there are certain times when plants don't want to be breathing? Okay, because there's very few times when I don't want to be breathing. Okay, animals don't want to be breathing maybe if we're on water, or maybe if something really smells bad. You know, we've had Taco Bell recently, and there's a lot, you know. But, you know, there are certain times when I don't want to be breathing, but for the most part, I want to be breathing constantly. There's not a time when I don't want to be doing some form of gas exchange with the outside air. But with plants, that doesn't seem to be the case. So what exactly is it that makes it so that plants can sometimes be breathing and other times not be? Okay, one of the big issues is that when plants open up their stomata to take in that CO2 from the air, which they desperately need for photosynthesis, they lose water. Okay, so when CO2 comes in, water vapor, all that water vapor I talked about that was inside of that leaf, goes out through the stomata along with the oxygen. Okay, but why? What is the force that is determining whether water will go into or out of the leaf? Okay, the mechanism of exchange in plants' gas exchange is passive diffusion. And this really shouldn't surprise you very much, because when we talked before about the forces that propel liquids, such as water, through the plant's circulatory system, we said that it was a passive process because it was produced by transpiration. The sun heats up the plant's leaf, the water vapor inside the plant evaporates out of the plant through the stomata, and when that happens, using the force of cohesion, it draws the water molecules still within the xylem up the tube of the plant, creating that negative pressure we learned about in the last lesson, and making it so that plants lose water through transpiration. Okay, and it draws the water up through their circulatory system. Well, a similar mechanism of exchange exists within the plants through their stomata, and I want to show this to you. Okay, I want you to pretend that this is the inside of the leaf. This is the epidermal layer. This is the stomata, and this is the outside gas that's just in the atmosphere outside the leaf. So this is just your normal outdoor air. Okay, the colors mean something. I want to show you the colors mean molecules. Okay, so blue molecules indicate water, red molecules indicate oxygen, and black molecules indicate carbon, such as carbon dioxide. Now, when we look on the inside of the plant leaves, we can see that there's a ton more water than anything else. So the plant leaves are full of water vapor. Okay, why does this make sense? Well, if we go back over here, we see that the xylem is constantly pumping water vapor into this gassy part of the leaf. Okay, and there's not a lot of anything else. It's just water and some oxygen that's hanging out inside this leaf. So we can see here a ton of water and a lot of oxygen. We do see a little bit of carbon because naturally there's going to be a little bit of carbon dioxide in there because it's produced when the plant respires, just like us. Okay, but that amount of carbon is insignificant to the amount of carbon that's in the outside atmosphere around the plant. So in the normal air outside the plant, we can see there's a much higher level of CO2, a lower level of oxygen relative to the inside of the leaf, and a low level of water relative to the inside of the leaf. Now, if you guys remember, concentration gradients is when chemical molecules are unevenly distributed across the membrane. So on one side, there's more of one thing than on the other. And in this case, when we look here, we can see that there's more water and oxygen on the inside of the leaf, and there's more CO2 on the outside of the leaf. So when this stomata opens, what's naturally going to want to occur is that the stuff that is greater on one side is going to want to passively flow towards its lesser concentration on the other side. In other words, all substances tend to flow from a high concentration to a low. And this takes no energy. Okay, so what's naturally going to happen is that when the stomata opens, the higher concentration of water is going to want to flow outside, so the water vapor is going to flow out of the leaf. The higher concentration of oxygen is going to do the same. It's going to flow out of the leaf towards the lower concentration. The higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the outer air is going to want to flow into the leaf towards the lower concentration of CO2. So in this case, what we see is that water vapor and oxygen flow naturally and passively out of the plant leaf, and CO2 flows in. So the mechanism, the force that drives the exchange of gases between the plant and the outside atmosphere is passive diffusion through concentration gradients. No energy is necessary in order to allow for this to occur. Now, what conditions can affect this water loss? Because as we can see, the gas exchange in plants is highly dependent upon water, probably much so than it is in animals, and we'll look at that in a moment. So the conditions that affect water loss in plants are when there's a bigger difference between the water content inside the leaf and then the outside air. Going back to this diagram here, okay, we can see that there's a lot more water on the inside of the leaf than the outside. But what if I made that even more dramatic? What if I made it so that like 2 water molecules were inside here and this was almost solid blue? Okay, so if the air outside the plant is very dry, or if conditions are very hot, or if it's very windy and all of the water vapor is being drawn away from the plant, those are the days when the plant is going to lose the most water. Okay, so dry, hot, or windy conditions are going to increase transpiration rates and make the water loss of the plant so much that it might not be able to survive. Okay, wet, cool, or moist days, or low temperature times of the day, are when the plant is going to most benefit from opening its stomata to allow CO2 in, because it's going to lose far less water, because there is less of a difference between the amount of water inside the leaf than outside. Okay, so the closer we are to having an equilibrium between the amount of water inside and outside the leaf, the less water we're going to lose in gas exchange. This means that different kind of plants will actually control when to open their stomata to get the best rates of CO2 intake versus water loss. And this brings us back to the mechanism that opens and closes the stomata. So this is brilliant. Plants open the stomata by filling them with water. They only do this when water is plentiful. So when the plant has enough water, they open the stomata, because it's okay if they lose some at that point. They have enough. But when the plant doesn't have enough water, they don't open the stomata. The stomata have to be filled with water to open. So if the plant is very dry, it won't have enough to open the stomata, and therefore the plants will make sure that they're not opening their leaves to have that gas exchange and to lose that water at very dry times when they don't have the water to afford to lose. So this is a really phenomenal way in which plants can control their transpiration rates. Now, let's talk a little bit about animals' gas exchange. So specifically, I'm going to use the human animal as our test subject. Animal gas exchange occurs through a very different system. We have specialized organs, not like leaves, which are mostly photosynthetic, but we have specialized organs specifically for gas exchange. If we look at these specialized organs, we can see that we have a tracheal tube that flows down from our throat. This is our windpipe that goes down your throat. It branches out into these two smaller diameter tubes called bronchi or bronchus, and it goes into smaller and smaller tubes that end up in these little air-filled sacs. The lungs themselves are going to be the sacs that surround this intricate network of air tubing. These sacs terminate in what we call alveoli, which are filled with these little gas-inflated bubbles that we're going to talk about in a bit. Beneath the lungs and beneath all of these crazy highways of gas exchange is the diaphragm, which is a large muscle that when it contracts is going to allow the lungs to expand, and when it relaxes is going to make the lungs squeeze tighter. Okay, and we're going to talk a little, that's going to be part of the mechanism that's going to help to drive air in and out the lungs. Let's take a closer look at these vessels. Okay, so some of the airways that we use are important because they demonstrate the importance of surface area to all these systems. Now, I talked about surface area. What does that mean? Surface area is the external surface of any object. Okay, so if I was holding a ball, if I was to take that ball and to cut it so it could lie flat, that flat surface I was looking at would be the surface area. Whereas if I put the ball back together again and it was enclosed, the space inside of the ball would be its volume. Now, we talked about the importance of surface area to volume before with cells. We said that the cell's membrane is its surface area, and it requires a large enough surface area to be able to feed its volume. If we think about it, the surface area of a cell is like its mouth, and the volume of a cell is like its stomach. All organisms need mouths that are large enough to feed their stomachs, and the same is true for your surface area to volume ratio. You need that ratio to be small enough so that the surface area can support the volume. It's very easy for the volume to outdo the surface area. Okay, so the reason for all these tubes inside of your lungs is to increase that surface area, because the more stuff you have, the more surfaces, the more tubes, the more area you have to perform gas exchange. So your trachea are the widest diameter airway. They have a very very high surface area to volume relationship, and they have a much higher volume than they have surface area. This is okay because we're not trying to exchange any gas with your trachea. The whole idea of your trachea is to bring in as much oxygen as possible. So with the trachea, it's okay if it's big. So the trachea is a large tube that's going to take in all of the air from the incoming atmosphere and also push out all the expelled or used air from your lungs. Your bronchi are going to be smaller diameter tubes that split that air that's coming in into two lungs. Why two? Again, to increase surface area. If you only had one lung, you would have half the surface area capacity and therefore half the gas exchange. You would only get half the oxygen you breathe, or actually probably far less. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But your bronchi are going to divert it to two lungs so you can increase that surface area. Once we get into the actual lungs, the bronchioles are going to be these highly branched, teeny little tubes that are going to deliver gas to these small alveoli, which are those air sacs on the end of those bronchi. The reason why, again, you have these huge systems of branched tubes within your lungs, not just these empty filled sacs of air, is to increase the surface area that you can have more and more gas exchange. So when you think about your lungs, don't think about them like these inflatable sacs in your body. Think of them more like these sacs that are containing these huge inflatable airways, these systems of tubes that are bringing oxygen into your body and delivering carbon dioxide out. So again, this is basically exactly what I just said, but your lungs, if they were just empty sacs, would have a huge volume and a very small surface area. So it's crucial that we have all those little vessels going through them. Your lungs expand and contract due to the motion of your diaphragm. So I mentioned before that a good circulatory system not only has a way to get the gas inside and some sort of organ to handle the gas, but also some sort of force to push the gas in and out of the system. This force in the lungs is due to the diaphragm, and it works in two different ways. And we're going to take a look at that here in just 1 second. So when your diaphragm releases, okay, when it relaxes, it pushes up on your lungs. When that happens, your lungs are compressed. Now, your lungs contain gas in all of these branch tubes. When gas is compressed, it's naturally going to increase in pressure. Okay, you guys should know this because if you guys have ever, filled up a balloon or something using a compressed air tank, or if you've, maybe gone scuba diving, or maybe, I don't know, if you've, I'm trying to think of any other gas system that you might have used. If you've ever used, like a spray or anything else like that, like a spray bottle or something, it increases air pressure to sort of mist stuff out. All of that is because when gas is compressed, the pressure increases in the gas, and it's naturally wanting to release, like a spray paint, or like sorry, I'm thinking more examples now, like the oil that you can spray onto your pans in the kitchen. All of that is incorporating compressed gas. Okay, so when your diaphragm, that big muscle, releases, it's going to compress your lungs and compress the gas in your lungs. That's going to make it so that the gas in your lungs is at a greater pressure than the gas in the surrounding atmosphere. Now, because of this, it creates a concentration gradient of pressure. So the higher pressure in your lungs is going to naturally want to flow to the lower pressure in the outside atmosphere. And that's actually what's going to cause the gas to go from your lungs to the outside air. Again, it's a concentration gradient. It doesn't just happen. It has to go from high pressure to low. Now, when that happens, then you're ready to intake a breath. So you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts downwards, allowing for your lungs to get bigger and to expand. When that happens, the air in your lungs actually has a lower pressure than the outside atmospheric air, and the air is compelled to move from the higher pressure atmosphere to the lower pressure of your lungs. Again, it's a concentration gradient. So inhalation is important because animals require an incredible amount of oxygen to power your system. Because each of your muscles requires such a high concentration of ATP, we have to use a lot of cellular respiration. And if you remember, cell respiration takes in oxygen and releases CO2 as a byproduct. Okay, so when you inhale, oxygen comes in through all those branching tubes and goes into those little gas-filled bubbles called the alveoli at the end of your bronchioles. Those alveoli are associated with capillaries in your blood system. Here we can see these capillaries right here in your lungs. The capillaries, when they come into your lungs, are filled with blue deoxygenated blood. They surround the alveoli, and when the O2 gets into the alveoli, it diffuses across their membranes passively into the deoxygenated blood. The reason it diffuses into the deoxygenated capillaries is because there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the alveoli, and there's a lower concentration of oxygen in the deoxygenated blood. Therefore, it wants to flow naturally, passively, from your alveoli into your blood. Outgoing CO2 is exchanged in the same way. Your blue blood, your deoxygenated blood, contains a high level of CO2 because it took that CO2 from your muscles. That CO2 is at a higher concentration in your blood than it is in the alveoli. So the CO2 diffuses across the alveoli into them and then goes back out into your bronchioles and through your system to be expelled. So oxygen and CO2 sort of pass each other going into and out of the alveoli. This is when your blood goes from blue to red, when it acquires the oxygen, which mixes with the hemoglobin, which has iron compounds in your blood, and turns it red. When you exhale, the CO2 is released from your bloodstream out into your alveoli and out of your bodies. Okay, so again, the force that allows this to occur is concentration gradients. There's a lot more oxygen in your incoming breath than in your deoxygenated blood, and vice versa for your CO2. Okay, that is really, really important. Concentration gradients must be established within your body to maintain homeostasis. This is a great example of showing how we don't just want equilibrium. We don't want an equal amount of CO2 in our blood and in our incoming air, just like we don't want an equal amount of oxygen in our incoming air versus our blood. We always want a slight difference, so that something wants to diffuse out of and into your blood. Your body has evolved so that the direction of that flow of blood will always have a slight difference, so that something will always want to diffuse into or out of it. This is called countercurrent exchange. To make sure that there's always a concentration gradient established, the blood flow in your lungs is opposite to the flow of incoming oxygen. In other words, the air that enters your body is flowing opposite to the direction of the blood that's flowing through your circulatory system. And this is what keeps many organisms this is what allows many organisms to have gas exchange, heat conservation, and to keep a balance of water and solutes in their systems. This is how it works. If you have two systems that are flowing in the same direction and they're exchanging something like oxygen or CO2, okay, let's pretend that this is red blood exchanging CO2 over here, or actually, no, let's pretend something else. Let's pretend that this is oxygenated blood exchanging oxygen from this blood to this non-oxygenated blood. So in other words, basically we're taking oxygenated blood and we're passing oxygen from that into this deoxygenated blood. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I just repeated myself. Sorry. So if they were traveling in the same direction as this exchange occurred, eventually they would reach equilibrium. In other words, they would have an exact same amount of oxygen. Now this means that there would no longer be any gas exchange between them. No more oxygen would naturally want to flow between one or the other because it was at equilibrium. If it's a countercurrent flow though, and they're exchanging in different directions, the exchange will be 100% over here. So we'll have all the red blood exchanging a ton of oxygen. And as we get over here, we're going to see that there's not going to be any because we've already delivered everything over here. So basically, I know this is probably very confusing to you guys looking at it, and I've just realized that this illustration isn't quite the one that I wanted to show you. So I apologize for that. We'll look into counter-current exchange in a little bit more detail soon, but I want to make sure to finish this video so that you guys don't have to sit here all day. Basically, the idea is that if we go in opposite directions, we can see that 100% of the gas from this blood vessel has been transferred to this one, whereas in this one, there's only 50% transfer. That's very inefficient. Over here, we have 100% transfer. Now, that does mean that we end up with deoxygenated blood on both sides over here, but this is really great if we're trying to maybe conserve oxygen over in this area of the body versus this area. Or, let's think about it, it might make more sense in terms of heat. If this is near to the core of your body, this would make a lot of sense if red represented heat and blue cold, because here we're trying to keep the heat closer to the core of your body. So the countercurrent exchange between the cold incoming blood and the warm outgoing blood makes sure that the warmth is conserved near to the core of your body, whereas the cold is allowed to go over here. This is actually a true system to illustrate how many things like birds can stand in freezing water and actually not have their legs completely freeze off or their cores completely shut down because they were cold. Okay, so who wins? Nobody. Plants have more passive systems of respiration, and animals have more active. This is just to illustrate our differences in our evolutionary histories and lifestyles. Okay? They both utilize very similar mechanisms of countercurrent. Well, not really countercurrent exchange in plants so much, but we see they utilize mechanisms of concentration gradients for sure. But they also differ in what they carry and their different organs that they use and the systems that they use and the things they have to worry about. We have to worry about having too much CO2 in our blood. You know, we need to worry about getting that out of our bloodstream. We have to worry about getting enough oxygen to our muscles. Plants have to worry about losing all that water constantly. So it's a constant give and take. All right, guys, that's it for today. Sorry I went a little bit over time. This is a fascinating subject, and I wanted to make sure that we could touch on most of the bases. All right, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day in this lesson. I hope you enjoy your week, and I can't wait to see you with the next lesson that's going to dive a little bit further into these cool systems of exchange. All right, guys, take care.